It is no secret to anyone that Star Wars and Lord of the Rings are two of my favorites. Both series, however, have underdog moments in them that are very similar in some ways to our text today. In Star Wars Episode 5 begins with the phrase, "It was a dark time for the rebellion." Throughout Episodes 4, 5, and 6, the small group of rebels are pitted against a galaxy-wide ruthless empire. Their cause seems hopeless, but they persist and are in the end victorious. The last book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy is entitled The Return of the King. In it, the Ranger Strider that is met in the first book is revealed to in fact be the rightful heir to the long empty throne of the Kingdom of Gondor. His true name is Aragon. I said it wrong both times. Aragorn. The stupid book has got me. Anyway, but being the rightful heir doesn't guarantee anything because his cause appears to be hopeless. The throne that he is hoping to reclaim is on the verge of being destroyed by the powers of darkness. Before he can claim his throne, he must first vanquish a seemingly unstoppable foe. Now these are, of course, fictional versions of the real-life David and Goliath matchup that we read about in the Bible, of a very small versus a very big foe. The would-be king in our text today is, in fact, a direct descendant of David himself. And so as we turn to 2 Chronicles 23, we're going to read about a David and Goliath type scenario occurring for one of his descendants. So starting in the first two verses of chapter 23 of 2 Chronicles. In the 7th year, Jehoida showed his strength. He made a covenant with the commanders of units of 100, Azariah son of Jehoram, Ishmael son of Johanan, Azariah son of Obed, Messiah son of Adai, and Elishaphat son of Zikri. They went throughout Judah and gathered the Levites and the heads of the Israelite families and from all the towns. When they came to Jerusalem, the whole assembly made a covenant with the king at the temple of God. We're talking about the 7th year. It says in the 7th year Jehoiada showed his strength. Thanks to the courage of Jehoida and Jehosheba, the child Joash that we learned about last week has been safely hidden at the temple, away from Queen Athaliah, who still wants to have him killed. Preserving the child's life was a huge first step, but at some point action will need to be taken to overthrow Athaliah. She is now the last surviving member of the house of Ahab, because Jehu is now king in Israel. He has replaced her brother. She is the last of Ahab's line. After her husband's murder of his brothers and her attempts to kill the rest of David's descendants, there really isn't anyone left for Athaliah to pass the crown to when she dies. Her family's rage and their wickedness have caused the destruction of their own future. She's going to be the last one way or another. Those opposed to her rule could have decided to bide their time, keep Joash hidden until she dies, and then try to put him on the throne. That would be a safe and sensible, cautious plan. But how long is that going to be? It might be decades before Athaliah dies of natural causes. And she's digging the people of Judah further and further into a hole of idolatry every day. What if waiting means waiting too long? What if a safe and easy way to accomplish this righteous objective never does present itself? Jehoiada knows, as a priest of the Lord, that he needs to act. But as the guardian of the child who should be king, he also needs to be cautious. If the plot that he is about to hatch is discovered before it can bear fruit, Joash will be killed and David's line will be extinguished. There is much to be gained by decisive action, but there is also much to risk. That tension between the need to act and the need to keep Joash safe caused Jehoiada to move slowly over 7 years until he was finally ready to move. So we see here in the second half, it says he made a covenant with the commanders of units of 100. Those at the top of the military were probably loyal to Athaliah, as leading officials usually are to the regime that promotes them and puts them in their place and keeps them in that position of power. So he didn't approach any generals. Jehoida approached the officers in the middle. Maybe in our military they might have been the equivalent of a captain or a major or something like that. The guys right in the middle is who he went to. He had the hopes of securing their support. He wanted to get them to commit to helping back Joash as the rightful king. Now each person that Jehoida includes in his conspiracy is one more added risk. Because it only takes one person to betray all of them and turn them in. But at the same time, Jehoida needs a force strong enough to overthrow the queen. Building up a rebellion in secret is a real catch-22. It needs to be small in order to be kept safe and secret, but it needs to grow in order to be effective enough to actually do anything. So he takes the risks and he talks to the commanders, and he sends them out throughout Judah to talk to the Levites and the heads of the Israelite families. Now that Jehoida has his core military officers on board with his plan, the plot is expanded to bring in the Levites, who would naturally be opposed to Athaliah's attacks on worship of the Lord. They ought to be on board from the beginning, and they are. And the leaders of the various clans of Judah, who would be unlikely to support Athaliah after she and her husband had killed so many members of the royal family, all of whom were fellow members of the tribe of Judah. So they both have reasons to join him. It says they came to Jerusalem. Jehoida needs to bring all those opposed to Athaliah to Jerusalem for that crucial moment, in order to overwhelm her supporters that she has there in the capital. This is the most vulnerable time for the conspiracy, as people come from all around to join it. If Athaliah has any spies near the temple, they'll likely notice the arrival of a large number of Levites and elders all coming together at the same time and place, and they might start to wonder what's going on. Verses 3 through 7 says, the whole assembly made a covenant with the king at the temple of God. Jehoida said to them, the king's son shall reign, and as the Lord promised concerning the descendants of David. Now this is what you are to do. A third of you priests and Levites who are going on duty on the Sabbath are to keep watch at the doors. A third of you at the royal palace, and a third of you at the foundation gate. And all the other men are to be in the courtyards of the temple of the Lord. No one is to enter the temple of the Lord except the priests and Levites on duty. They may enter because they are consecrated, but all the other men are to guard what the Lord has assigned to them. The Levites are to station themselves around the king, each man with his weapons in his hand. Anyone who enters the temple must be put to death. Stay close to the king wherever he goes. So Jehoida starts to reveal his plan and tell everybody what their part of it is going to be. The first thing is that they make a covenant together with the king. For the first time in 7 years, the heir of David is revealed publicly to those who have joined the rebellion. Most everybody probably until this moment thought that he was dead. Obviously, Jehoida would have kept it secret. So this would have been a mass revelation to these people. The king's heir is really alive. Keep in mind that Joash is only 7 years old. Jehoida will necessarily be his regent for years to come if the plan works. So the officers and the Levites and the elders of Judah are committing themselves to the idea of the rightful king. They have no idea what kind of man Joash will one day be in a decade or so when he becomes man. But there's no reason to believe that he will be anything like the disaster that Athaliah's reign has been for everybody. Jehoida proclaims that the king's son shall reign, as the Lord promised. Before laying out his plan in detail, Jehoida reminds his fellow conspirators that they're not only defending the traditional right of Joash to inherit the throne from his father, but they're at the same time acting as instruments of the will of God by helping to fulfill the promise of God to have the descendant of David sitting on the throne. That's a powerful combination. They're actually righting a wrong and at the same time fulfilling a promise of God. So he gives them their motivation before they get their orders. And then he says, all right, Levites, You guys guard this entrance and that gate. He sends them where they need to be. Jehoiada keeps the Levites at the temple when their regular shift ends. So not only does he have today's shift of Levites, but he has yesterday's as well to increase the size of his force. And then he divides them up to cover the strategic entrances and gates of the temple complex, as well as reserving 1/3 of them within the temple itself to act as a bodyguard of the king. If somehow Athaliah's army, if her forces manage to break into the temple compound, this is where they'll make their last stand around the king. He says this, "No one is to enter the temple except the priests and Levites, because they're consecrated." A situation as dire and as important as the one facing Jehoiada could have and might have tempted him to ignore the normal rules that exist in the temple regarding access. Who is supposed to be allowed in what way? They could have said necessity means we need to break some of the rules. Instead, Jehoiada divided his forces in such a way as to honor the commands of God about who is and who is not allowed into the temple. They maintained their commitment to doing things the right way, even in a difficult circumstance. For Jehoiada, I don't know if it was difficult for him to make this decision. It might have been second nature. He might have not thought about breaking that rule. But for many people throughout history and people in our world today, there is a real struggle over the question of whether or not the ends justify the means. We all know that phrase. People ask themselves, if the cause is righteous, do the means of bringing it about also have to be righteous? Or does having a lofty and worthy goal excuse whatever unsavory method you have to find to achieve it? People struggle with that issue. Especially when facing a brutal or oppressive regime or an entirely corrupt system. You think you're up against all of that. How can you possibly take that down and bring about justice without stooping to their level? It's a very difficult question for revolutionaries and rebels throughout history. These are not easily answered questions, but for Jehoiada, he dismisses them out of hand. The Levites and the priests are going to be the ones defending the king of the temple. Us and us alone, we will do it because we are the ones that are allowed to be here. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, dismissed that line of thinking as well. Paul wrote this. He said, he dismissed the idea that people had raised, let us do evil that good may result. He threw that out of hand. He said, that's self-defeating. That whole line of thought is no good. Now, we have an idiom in English that agrees with Jehoiada and Paul. We know this. 2 wrongs don't make a right. We all know that phrase, and it's certainly true. We know in our hearts that our methods have to be as lofty as our goals if we are to be all that God wants us to be. So they do this in the right way. And then he says this. He reminds them that anyone who enters the temple must be put to death, and that they need to stay close to the king. Jehoiada has set his plans and divided his forces to cover the key positions. So he concludes by reminding them how high the stakes are. This is a life or death matter. If Athaliah sends troops into the temple, it will be kill or be killed. Lastly, Jehoiada reminds them to stay with the king no matter what. The line of David must be protected at all costs. If the child dies, then everything is in vain. Everything is now set. 7 years of waiting under a wicked queen will now be resolved. The question remains, will the people of Jerusalem be loyal to Athaliah? Will they rally around her and attack the temple and cause much bloodshed? Or will they rally around the 7-year-old would-be king? This day will either be the renewal of David's line or its end. And the majority of the priests of the Lord will perish along with the child if they fail. So everything depends on what happens next. Verses 8 through 11. The Levites and all the men of Judah did just as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each one took his men, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath and those who were going off duty, for Jehoiada the priest had not released any of the divisions. Then he gave the commanders of units of 100 the spears and the large and small shields that had belonged to King David and that were in the temple of God. He stationed all the men, each with his weapon in his hand, around the king, near the altar and the temple, from the south side to the north side of the temple. Jehoida and his sons brought out the king's son and put the crown on him. They presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. They anointed him and shouted, "Long live the king!" The plan begins to go in motion. The Levites and all the men of Judah do what Jehoida says. There are several moments in this revolution where things could have fallen apart, and this is the first one of them. All of Jehoiada's careful planning and building up of this conspiracy against Athaliah would have been in vain if those gathered at the temple had balked at Jehoiada's leadership, or if they had failed to properly execute his plan. Jehoiada's authority is, however, bolstered by his marriage to the former king's sister, as well as his wife's rescue of the child that they hope to make king. So they have some moral authority there. But some of the elders of Judah might have hesitated to take orders from a Levite. Who are you as a Levite to tell us what to do? Some of them might have doubted the military skill of a priest. You're a priest. What do you know about doing a revolution? Men might have also given in to anxiety. At the crucial moment, they might have said, you know what, I think that's a dumb idea. It's going to get us killed. They might have failed at their task. The plan to block off these entrances all around the temple complex would have fallen apart if some of the groups decided that they just couldn't do it. But none of them did. Jehoiada's plan is unfolding properly. The question that will remain is it going to be enough? Will they succeed? First thing they do is they pass out the weapons. They gave them weapons from the temple that King David had placed there many years before. I think David would have been heartbroken to know that one day the weapons he had placed in the temple complex would be needed 150 years later, not to repel a foreign army, not because an army of the Egyptians or the Syrians or whatever was laying siege to Jerusalem and they needed these weapons. That's not why they were taken out of the temple. They were taken out so that priests and Levites could defend the last surviving male descendant of the line of David. How heartbreaking that must have been to contemplate how low things have gotten, that it has come to this. Notice that it's Jehoida and his sons that are putting the crown on the king. Jehoida isn't taking his own life at risk here alone. It's not just him. It's his sons as well. If this rebellion fails, his entire family will be wiped out. That's how important this is to Jehoida. They refer to Joash as the king's son. That is a reminder that these men are trying to restore the rightful heir to the throne, not simply replacing an unpopular queen with someone that they like more. This is about who is right. Athaliah was unpopular, we know that, not to mention evil. And Joash was young and therefore potentially much better to be king someday. That certainly helped, I'm sure, with some of the people that were on the fence to get them on board. But at the same time, this is about doing the right thing as much as it is about doing what's best for the kingdom. I think if you ponder that scene, the crown must have looked pretty interesting sitting on this 7-year-old's head. It's built for a man. I would imagine when they put it on Joash's head, it went all the way down past his ears. I don't know how they got it to fit. Maybe they put something inside of it to make it smaller. I don't know how they got the crown. Did they steal it from the palace? Or did the priests always have the crown? When Ahaziah, Joash's father, when he went away to war in Israel, did they leave the crown with the priests? No, we don't know that part of the story. But now we have the scene. Priests and Levites standing around this 7-year-old with the crown on his head. They present him with a copy of the covenant and proclaim him king. As the new monarch of a nation that is dedicated to the Lord, the text of that covenant is as important to the king of Judah as the Constitution is to the President of the United States. It is the writings of Moses. It will provide not only history and law, but morality and wisdom. It's indispensable for a ruler of this people, he has to have the covenant. Now this is, of course, a symbolic act, handing him the covenant. He's only 7 years old. He's not going to be making any decisions based upon the law for a good while yet. But I think it's important because it contrasts so very much with the abandonment of the law under Athaliah and under her son and under her husband. All of these years they've ignored the law, and now they give the law to the king. They anoint him and they declare, "Long live the king." There's no going back now. The anointing is the act that makes Joash king in the eyes of God. As when Samuel came to the house of Jesse and anointed David king. From that moment, he was the rightful king. The shouts were the equivalent of a battle cry. They are meant to be heard outside of the temple. They have now, in essence, declared war on Athaliah and all who support her. It is now the palace versus the temple. Athaliah's loyal henchmen versus the priests of the Lord. On whose side, then, will the people of Jerusalem be? Verses 12 through 15 we will find out. When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and cheering the king, she went to them at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets and singing, and singers with musical instruments were leading the praises. Then Athaliah tore her robes and shouted, "Treason! Treason!" Jehoida, the priest, sent out the commanders of units of 100, who were in charge of the troops, and said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest had said, "Do not put her to death at the temple of the Lord." So they seized her as she reached the entrance of the horse gate on the palace grounds, and there they put her to death. Athaliah hears the noise of the people running and cheering the king. The ordinary people of Jerusalem, when given a choice between loyalty to Athaliah or supporting the great-grandson of Jehoshaphat, they waste no time in making their choice known. Instead of shutting their doors and letting these other two groups fight out who's going to be king, which a lot of time the common people do, they don't care who's king, let's just stay out of it. Instead of that, the people throng into the streets in celebration as they run to the temple to cheer on the new king. Athaliah ruled through fear and murder, embracing the worship of Baal that the family of Ahab had chosen. The people are eager to be rid of her. She comes to the temple of the Lord. Perhaps she didn't believe her eyes or her ears. Instead of blockading herself in the palace, which would have probably been a prudent thing to do, or maybe even sneaking out of Jerusalem with a cartload of gold, instead of running for it, she goes to the temple to see for herself, to see what is really happening. And there's the king, and all the people around her singing and celebrating and rejoicing with this new king. The scene that confronted her when she reached the temple was far worse for her than she could have imagined. The child that had escaped her executioners is now crowned and flanked by the leading members of the military, as well as tribal leaders and the whole priesthood. Everyone has turned against her. On top of that, the regular people, the common people, are celebrating her demise, as if the end of her reign is something that calls for a party. Long live the king is mixed, I think, with the sentiment of the people, with good riddance to the queen. It's too much for her to handle. This shocks her too much, and she cries out as she rips her robes, "Treason!" It was obviously treason. Everybody in Jerusalem knew that she was being overthrown, but nobody was upset about it. They were too busy celebrating. Athaliah's outburst must have halted the music and quieted the crowd. Imagine seeing everybody celebrating, and then she screams out, and everybody stops to look at her. Suddenly, she's standing all alone in the midst of a crowd that hates her for the evil that she has done. So Jehoida orders them, "Take her out of here and don't kill her at the temple." With the whole city celebrating Joash, it seems unlikely that anyone would have stuck with Athaliah. It's not as if she is the kind of queen that had engendered loyalty through her kindness. Her crimes of murdering her family deserved death, as did her promotion of idolatry amongst the people. But Jehoida was careful to ensure that her blood would not be spilled in this holy place. Jehoiada's men took her back to the palace, a fitting place for her to come to an end, because she had been willing to kill to live in this building, to live in this palace. It is fitting that that is where she ended, and they put her to death there. Thus ends a third wicked ruler for Judah in a row. Jehoram, then his son Ahaziah, and then his wife Athaliah, each of them wicked. Which leaves the people now of Judah with Jehoram's grandson, the 7-year-old Joash, in the care of the priest Jehoida. Verses 16 to 21 is our postscript. Jehoida then made a covenant that he and the people and the king would be the Lord's people. All the people went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They smashed the altars and idols and killed Matan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. Then Jehoida placed the oversight of the temple of the Lord in the hands of the priests, who were Levites, to whom David had made assignments in the temple, to present the burnt offerings of the Lord, as written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and singing, as David had ordered. He also stationed doorkeepers at the gates of the Lord's temple, so that no one who was in any way unclean might enter. He took with him the commanders of hundreds, the nobles, the rulers of the people, and all the people of the land, and brought the king down from the temple of the Lord. They went into the palace through the upper gate and seated the king on the royal throne. And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet, because Athaliah had been slain with the sword. Here we see the restoration, the final restoration of the house of David. Jehoida makes a covenant with the people and the king. The original covenant of Abraham, the expanded covenant of Moses, and the covenant with David are all still in effect. They cannot be revoked, and they cannot be nullified. However, because of the egregious nature of the idolatry fostered by the family of Ahab, through the last 3 reigns of Jehoram, Ahaziah, and Athaliah, Jehoida feels that it is necessary for this generation here and now to repudiate those attempts to lead them away from God. And therefore, he has them recommit themselves to the covenant of their ancestors with the Lord. Following that moment, all the people go to the temple of Baal and they rip it apart. They destroy it. With their newly renewed commitment to serving God and God alone fresh in their minds, the process of purging the idolatry of Baal worship from the land begins with the destruction of the temple that had been built in Jerusalem. For there to ever have been 2 temples or more in Jerusalem is a sign of how far the people had fallen away from God, how far they had walked away from their devotion to the Lord. It must have galled Jehoida day after day for those 7 years while he had to bide his time. All the other priests must have been sick to know that here in Jerusalem, where the temple of the Lord is, that there is also a temple to a false god that is being worshipped here and being supported by our government. That must have just rankled them day after day. It must have been very satisfying to tear it down and destroy it. Then they go into the palace, and this is the scene, the finale of this, the storybook ending. They put the king on the throne. Everyone is rejoicing. Because Jehosheba had risked her life 7 years ago to save a child named Joash, and because Jehoida had risked his life to keep him hidden for 7 years, and the rest of the priests and the Levites and the elders, and then eventually the common people as well, had decided to join in to Jehoiada's revolution. Because of all of that zeal, because of all of that courage, there is now a new king descended from David sitting upon the throne, and a nation that is rejoicing in its deliverance. The hard work of restoring the proper worship of the Lord and rooting out the false gods remains ahead. We saw a little bit of that in 18 and 19 when Jehoiada begins to put reforms in place for the temple. The next chapter we will see what kind of man Joash becomes when he grows up. So what lesson can we draw for ourselves from this history? from the priestly revolution that restored the throne of David. We're not likely to have a priestly revolution in the United States anytime soon. So what lesson can we draw from this? Firstly, I think this: the revolution would not have been possible if any of the participants had put their own safety above the needs of the people. To accomplish great things for God often requires that we be willing to risk much. If we're going to do much, we need to risk much. Secondly, when this movement began, it seemed hopeless. Athaliah was in control. Joash is only a baby. And yet they continued. We too need to avoid weighing the strengths and the weaknesses as we see them. Because if we, like Jehoida and Jehosheba, have God on our side, it does not matter who it is that opposes us. Weighing the options is not that big a deal when God is on your side. And lastly this: you and I may never find ourselves in a life or death struggle like this one. But that doesn't mean that we can't act with the courage of our convictions because of our faith in the numerous situations that we do find ourselves in. If they were willing to act when their lives were on the line, what excuse do we have if we fail to act?